Welcome back, everybody. Welcome to session 2 of the MPP Policy Lab presentations for the 2021 graduating year. My name is Chris Reagan. I am the director of the Max Bell School of Public Policy. And let me begin by saying that I am sitting in my home in Gimli, Manitoba, which is situated on what is referred to as Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe. Now, many of you are actually closer to McGill's downtown Montreal campus, in which case you are on traditional territory of the Kanekahaka, what is often called the Mohawk Nation. But wherever you are currently sitting, and I know that many of you are currently sitting outside of Canada, I encourage you to better understand the history of your location and to recognize its Indigenous heritage. Now, let me give you very briefly the rules of engagement for the next 1 hour, and it's going to be exactly 1 hour. The team has 30 minutes for its presentation, and at the 28-minute mark, my egg timer will ring, and they just heard it about 3 minutes ago, so I'm not gonna play it again. Then we're gonna have 10 minutes of Q&A from faculty, and in this case, the 3 faculty are gonna be Natalie, Jennifer, and Lucy Locke. Then we're gonna have 10 minutes of questions from the sponsors from 60 Million Girls. And then 10 minutes of Q&A where I open it up to everybody. So please, I encourage you, if you've got a question, to put your question in the chat box and I will collect them, especially, by the way, if you are in that third category of not faculty and not sponsor. But put your questions in the chat box and then I will call on you, and we're gonna get this up and down in 60 minutes. So without further ado, let me turn it over to the team. The sponsor for this policy lab is 60 Million Girls, and the challenge is what technology developments might best provide innovative solutions for education in remote regions which have no internet access. So take it away, team 60 Million Girls.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that introduction. You can all see my screen, I hope? Wonderful. Well, thank you all for coming today. We'd like to start our presentation by introducing you to someone that our team has been trying to get to know over the last few months. This is Aminata. She's 15 years old and she lives in Sierra Leone. Like over half of the population of the country, she lives in a rural area. Aminata is a regular kid. She loves to eat her mother's okra stew with rice, to play football with her friends, and to help out on her family's small farm. Her first language is Creole, but she is learning some English at her local school. The classroom is crowded and the teacher often seems overwhelmed. Aminata has to share old textbooks with some of her friends, but Aminata loves school. Right now, her favorite subject is agricultural science. Like 64% of children in Sierra Leone, she has completed primary school, but her future in schooling is uncertain. Only 44% of children complete junior secondary school, and only 22% complete senior education in Sierra Leone. The farm continues to be demanding, and as she grows older, Aminata is beginning to feel the pressure of expectation to help out more with the work, sometimes missing school days. She has also overheard her parents begin to talk about arranging a marriage for her. She is still young, but they had a poor season on the farm, and the bride price would help her parents feed her brothers and sisters. She doesn't know how she feels about marriage. About 3 out of 10 girls in Sierra Leone marry before the age of 18, and some of her friends are already married. The idea is exciting in some ways, but it also makes her nervous. She knows that if she does marry, also like 3 out of 10 Sierra Leone girls, she may start bearing children soon. If that happens, her education will likely fall by the wayside. And in her heart of hearts, she wants to finish secondary school because she believes it will help her better provide for herself and for her family, but most importantly, Aminata just loves learning. Aminata's future and the future of thousands and thousands of girls in Sierra Leone with a similar story is currently a question mark. While the government is directing more attention and budgetary weight towards education, these efforts remain nascent. And so our team has been wondering, are there fresh ideas or creative approaches that could help Aminata finish her schooling? What would these look like? It's with questions like these and with girls like Aminata in mind that we would like to introduce ourselves and our project. For the past several months, our team has been thinking about how to address educational gender inequality through EdTech solutions in Sierra Leone. Our work was commissioned by 60 Million Girls, a public foundation in Montreal dedicated to girls' education in developing countries, and it was a part of our master's degree at the Maxwell School of Public Policy, as you all know. But before we dive in, allow us to introduce ourselves.
Hello, everyone. I'm Gina Maldonado. I'm from Lima, Peru. I'm a social entrepreneur, and I work in women's economic empowerment initiatives.
Hello, everyone. I'm Gulrukh Kitbai, and I'm from Lahore, Pakistan. I have a background in management consulting focused on government and economic development projects.
My name is James Samimi Farr from Chelsea, Quebec, Canada, and I work in media and communications.
Hello, I'm Nayantara Sadakar from New Delhi, India, and I have a background in frontline work with equity-seeking groups.
Hello, I'm Sarah Sayani from Karachi, Pakistan. I have a background in microfinancing.
Thank you. And our work was guided and coached by Dr. Niadi, who's with us. Essentially, our work revolved around a question, which is a bit of a mouthful, so I hope you'll bear with me. How can stakeholders in developing countries such as Sierra Leone leverage innovative technologies to ensure equal access to quality education for children, especially girls in remote communities, by 2030? To answer this question, we conducted over 20 interviews with NGOs on the ground, organizations with experience in EdTech, and we supplemented these interviews with a broad range of literature. We're delighted to be with you today. And now I'd like to invite my colleague Nayantara to discuss the framework that helped guide our research.
Thank you, James. So we use a human rights-based approach to education, or HRBAE, as a conceptual and practical framework to translate into actions the standards that have been set out to the right to education. HRBA has at its core 5 principles, which is what we have outlined our proposal along. So at each stage, we have asked ourselves, how does what we are proposing support the 5 values of participation, accountability, non-discrimination, empowerment, and legality? And these 5 values, along with the Declaration of Human Rights, have also guided the creation of the Sustainable Development Goals, which have in their own right been highly influential in guiding development efforts. We have narrowed down to SDG 4, quality education, and SDG 5, gender equality and women's empowerment. Specifically, we focus on how our proposal contributes to target 4.1, which aims to ensure that all children complete free, equitable, and quality primary and secondary education, leading to relevant and effective learning outcomes. We also try and keep in mind target 4.5, which works towards eliminating gender disparities in education and ensuring equal access to all levels of education for the vulnerable, including children in vulnerable situations. And lastly, target 5.B, which emphasizes the use of enabling technology, and in particular, this would be the information and communications technology to promote the empowerment of women. Currently, 60 Million Girls has made explicit links to the Millennium Development Goals on their website, and through our proposal, we are proposing a more explicit alignment with the SDG goals. Lastly, we have also kept in mind the gender mainstreaming approach to promote the best interests of the girl child. I'm going to hand it off to Gulrukh now, who will start us off on a brief summary of what the Mobile Learning Lab is, its value proposition, and some best practices associated with it.
Thank you so much, Nayantara. So I'm going to start off by discussing what the Mobile Learning Lab is and some of its key components. So the Mobile Learning Lab is a technology-based solution to address gender disparity in educational outcomes and is a particular application of the REACHL, or Remote Area Community Hotspot for Education and Learning Technology. The REACHL itself is essentially a portable server that can be accessed without the internet and is paired with a set of tablets or smartphones, along with a way of charging the battery through solar power. And these elements together make up an MLL. The MLL is not intended to replace the local curriculum or compete with local teachers, but rather to supplement their overall efforts. Moving on to the value proposition of the MLL. While the MLL is not itself specifically designed to address gender disparities in education, it has many elements integral to its design and application that make it well suited to serve this purpose to help young girls in Sierra Leone. As James will discuss in the next data and case study section, MLLs have been shown to improve literacy and numeracy, as well as resulted in improved confidence generally for girls in their education. The MLL offers practical features to a holistic approach because it is simple, inexpensive, easily transportable, and does not require the internet, which is a crucial feature in remote villages where online connectivity is not always readily available. The MLL's focus on providing a self-directed learning environment is also particularly useful because it allows students to explore their own passions or interests by enabling them to come in after school and utilize the MLL by choosing from a wide array of applications themselves under adult supervision without imposing on the teacher schedules. The MLL's clear value addition in the educational landscape and economy of Sierra Leone also helps engage the business community because they realize that the Mobile Learning Lab teaches youth basic computer literacy skills which they do not get access to otherwise. This could also attract future potential funding for MLL projects in Sierra Leone. The implementation of the MLL also helps local educational authorities, such as Sierra Leone's Ministry of Basic and Senior Secondary Education, signal a positive message that they're making practical progress towards achieving their organizational goals and strategic objectives, including the improvement of access, equity, and completion of education. Moving on, based on our research, stakeholder interviews, and literature reviews, we have identified 5 broad best practices which future uses of MLLs would benefit from. So firstly, our research suggests that targeted interventions would be best for specific age groups to create the greatest impact on learning outcomes to ensure that girls stay in school, in addition to allowing for better monitoring and evaluation. Second, setting clear learning objectives aligned with the national curriculum is another observed best practice, because sorting through thousands of resources online can be an exhausting task for even the most well-informed and talented teachers and students. Thirdly, collaboration with local implementation partners is also observed as being essential, because an organization on the ground in Sierra Leone can coordinate localized content generation. Time-limited MLL interventions are another observed best practice as they help ensure long-term sustainability of the MLL and make it easier to track and monitor learning outcomes after each intervention. And lastly, the cultivation of community ownership is also seen as being very important. And to do this, MLL access could be provided for community members outside the schools, such as caregivers, as that would develop a sense of civic responsibility towards guarding the devices and would also give parents' opinions on the MLL a greater weight in the feedback loop mechanism. I would now like to call upon James to discuss some of the data and case studies we have analyzed in our overall analysis.
Thank you, Golruk. From 2017 until now, the MLL's worldwide deployment has reached over 20 countries from Africa, Central America, and Asia. 60 Million Girls has partnered and worked alongside about 20 local implementing partners and has helped more than 10,000 children from hundreds of communities. Sierra Leone is special to 60 Million Girls in the MLL because it's one of the first places where it was implemented, and it's also where 60 Million Girls ran their evaluation pilot project of the MLL. As we were taking a closer look at the details of MLL deployment in Sierra Leone and other countries, we found many rich and promising nuggets of insight from the case studies. For instance, in Sierra Leone, the deployment of the MLL coincided with the Ebola outbreak, during which MLLs were able to keep children educated while schools were shut down. And this was tested again during the COVID-19 pandemic with similar outcomes. Moreover, parents have been getting involved in the guardianship of the devices, as well as the children's engagement in the access and use of the MLL. As mentioned before, the MLL can be adapted to multiple uses and users. Right now in Uganda, it's being adapted for children with visual and hearing impairments, mental and physical disabilities, and global developmental delay. What we think is important to highlight here is that evidence is showing positive effects of using the MLL on math and literacy skills, as well as on non-cognitive skills such as intrinsic motivation, self-confidence, and levels of aspiration. Overall, we're seeing great engagement in the MLL over the long term, with attendance rates of over 90% from the students. We're also seeing that the MLL builds interest in using technology and navigating digital resources. It motivates curiosity for other subjects such as STEM and business. It has a low operating cost of 8 cents per hour per student. And as mentioned, it shows improvement for students in both cognitive and non-cognitive skills. Literacy skills in particular went up in one case study with a 31% increase versus the baseline. I'd like to now invite Nayantara to discuss MLL partners and stakeholders.
Thank you, James. So within our context, stakeholders can be referred to as educational stakeholders. And the appropriate educational stakeholders for the MLL are those who play a powerful role in identifying and targeting mechanisms to improve access to education for girls. As such, the most important MLL partner are the children, and the girl children more specifically. Children living in poverty or in violent contexts have very little control over what actually happens around them. The MLL gives them a chance to indulge in their intrinsic curiosity and explore topics that match their individual needs. So all other MLL partners need to make special efforts and align their actions with the best interests of the children. Some other stakeholders that we have identified include the government, the businesses, which include micro, small, and medium enterprises, and national multinational corporations, school heads, teachers, and the community and parents. Nonprofits have also continuously played an important role as educational stakeholders. For example, most recently, 60 Million Girls is working with their partner CAMFED in Ghana to prove a financially sustainable model with an investor school willing to invest in the MLL, as well as looking at ways to engage new MLL facilitators, such as young women volunteers. But mapping stakeholders is really just the beginning. The next step is to create a collaborative environment. And we find community engagement is critical to ensuring that those who are affected by the MLL project feel empowered to take part in developing practices that affect their lives. So to engage with the community, we drew inspiration from Sierra Leone's Free Education Project. The stakeholder engagement plan for the Free Education Project emphasized a focus on answering 3 questions when creating an engagement plan. Who will be directly and indirectly affected by the projects? How does the project reach out to stakeholders? And how does the project share information and get stakeholders involved in decision-making and implementation of the project? In our engagement plan, we answer these 3 questions and pay particular attention to how we can engage vulnerable groups, especially girls in rural communities. And this includes having a women-only workshop in addition to community meetings in order to provide a safe space to share the concerns related to the MLL and educating girls more broadly. But lastly, we also research ways to keep the community engaged even past the planning and the initial implementation of the MLL. Our research suggests that we develop a grievance redress mechanism, which will provide stakeholders with a channel to share their feedback with us and promote monitoring and evaluation practices of the MLL. I'm now going to hand it over to Sarah, who will explain how we can close some of the knowledge gaps that our educational stakeholders may have, along with how some of the stakeholders can support funding of the MLL.
Thank you, Nantara. In addressing the awareness and knowledge gaps, we have found peer and self-directed learning as a distinct avenue of EdTech adoption. Sugata Mitra's EdTech experiments in the developing countries and Khan Academy lessons have particularly shown how effective peer learning and self-directed approach is in adopting EdTech solutions. It's amazing what children figure out themselves that adults cannot. However, a question we ask ourselves and also emerge in our interviews with stakeholders: what do we know about these communities' willingness and capacity to adapt technology-based solutions? The participatory approach derived from the human-centered design focuses on the root cause of MLL deployment. That is the issue of conflict, a choice between education and other things that each household has to make, usually in the form of picking odd jobs over education for their children. For this reason, we have identified 4 funding partners to provide communities with the criteria for making the trade-offs. This calls for teachers' capacity building, as teachers are the first point of contact. To reduce the knowledge gaps in rural communities, teachers are education ambassadors to educate households on the importance of education and skills development for the growth of every child, especially girls. Implementing partners and volunteers or interns are seen as educational advocates. Implementing partners' role goes beyond administrative housekeeping of the project. They help establish communication and collaboration with households to build trust and accountability in the system. Community volunteers or interns are influential drivers to empower girls to participate because they are seen as role models in communities. And most importantly, these volunteers are future teachers. The collaborative deliberation approach is derived from Learning Matrix Task Force. When we are seeking solutions of our knowledge gaps in participatory approach, it is equally important to involve multiple partners in monitoring the progress. With the involvement of school staff, teachers, management, admin staff, parents, community members, implementing partners, and funding partners, a holistic performance evaluation is possible. Student supportive learning is also possible with the focus on development of soft skills, such as creativity, level of communication, interpersonal abilities, reasoning, and responses. Moving forward to our funding partnership framework, we have identified co-financing as a suitable approach because it establishes a mechanism to track performance and contribution of relevant stakeholders. It sets a funding framework as a guidelines for future investment opportunities, and it institutes a collaborative approach to establish strong institutional capacity for better resource mobilization and balanced market participation. Therefore, the 4 funding partners we have identified are micro, small, and medium enterprises, MSMEs, that see MLL as a revenue generating stream and would invest based on minimum fees generated from the participants' contribution. Civil society institutions, non-governmental organizations, local or international, that help create accountability of educational outreach in government-supported schools in rural areas. Direct donor funds for MLL setup and its upkeep, joint effort of MSMEs and civil society institutions or NGOs using MLL for entrepreneurial development to boost employment and skills development. Now, I would kindly ask Gina to elaborate on the outlook of our project. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Although the MLL is a model with proven results, can we go to the next slide, please?
Yes, apparently it's not just rural communities in Sierra Leone that have poor connectivity. I'm currently trying to make it go to the next slide. One moment.
I can explain because we can continue. Okay. I was saying, although the MLL is a model with proven results, we believe there's still space for improvement. And our work has allowed us to identify two pathways of possibilities for improving its value proposition and operational framework. The first one is by expanding its use and application, and the second through the design of a scalable model. So after parents and caregivers, teachers are the second closest, most influential persons in a child's education. And we have reasons to believe that the MLL devices and materials should also include teachers as beneficiaries. As Sarah mentioned before, to reduce awareness and knowledge gaps, it could be helped to implement a teacher training program that could be as short as a 3-hour bootcamp for learning the basics on how to use the MLL, or as long as a continuous learning program for updating their knowledge. In any case, teachers trained may tend to use the MLL more during their lectures. Another possibility is to work with different types of beneficiaries according to local contexts. From farmers to prisoners looking for a second chance to reintegrate into society, options for where and who can access and use the MLL are endless. Also, the increasing availability of smartphones is a promising factor for extending the use of the MLL and a potential reduction in expenses in tablets. And more especially, the ownership of these devices is expected to engage more its users. Regarding data collection, the latest upgraded Rachel devices have the capability to report back data as new proofs of performance. And this exercise will help continue improving MLL's monitor and evaluation efforts, which ultimately contributes to better evidence-based decision-making. Lastly, even though the original focus of this project is rural areas, the MLL is also a viable option for urban areas where internet access is available but limited, especially these days in which reliability and connectivity are terms that have gained importance due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Moving on to the second pathway to improve the MLL model, the following are key insights for designing a scalable model. As James mentioned before, we chose the Sierra Leone case as a proof of concept to continue expanding the MLL impact in other communities. To do so, an opportunity to continue scaling this program is to frame the MLL as a social business model with a global perspective and a local approach. In simple words, this means an operational framework easy to implement and a proposition of high value for local people that could respond to real needs. A second aspect is the approach to the financing scheme, as Sarah mentioned before. A financially sustainable model requires a different perspective. It needs to be defined in terms of social investments rather than short-term development projects. In addition to this, the MLL should be seen as promoted as an opportunity for the education market. We're talking about preparing the next labor market generation. If so, the business sector could be more involved in a mid and long-term investment. Also, when developing an international project, it is critical to determine which parts must remain neutral and which must be modified and adjusted to the socio-cultural context. This is what we refer to as a standardized management framework with context-driven adaptations. What we do need to keep in mind here is that this model won't fit every context, but ones with similar challenges in terms of connectivity, gender gaps, and access to quality education. Another important element of this scalable model is to be data-driven. What this means is to have some key statistics publicly shown on the MLL geographic scope, their local implementing partners, the number of beneficiaries, issues addressed, funds raised, and among others. Last, there's a business case for the MLL to be framed as a women-owned social business model, because there's an already gained social capital among local women, and there's also a greater worldwide interest in education in rural areas due to the pandemic impacts. Before presenting our recommendations, we believe there are some actions that can take place in the shortest term possible, and now Nayantara is going to shed light on our quick wins.
Thank you, Gina. Yes, so we have identified some reforms that 60 million girls can make in the immediate term. First, displaying the MLL theory of change on the 60 Million Girls website could help people to understand why and how the MLL is a great model for promoting access to education in children. And this should include a human rights-based approach with a special emphasis on Sustainable Development Goals 4 and 5, along with gender mainstreaming concepts. Call for volunteers and interns to support the implementation of this policy lab recommendation is also suggested, as this will empower them to become future teachers so they can fill the human resource gap in the education field. In order to increase evidence and visibility, it is recommended that 60 Million Girls organize a meeting with their local implementing partners in which they can share their current challenges and potential solutions for deploying the MLL under the special circumstances they are experiencing due to the pandemic. Likewise, to better understand the information gathered in project reports, it would be interesting to add another layer of analysis and run a user journey mapping tool, which is a tool that allows visualizing the experience of an MLL user throughout its implementation that will help to know their needs and their perceptions. Lastly, we recommend defining and promoting the MLL as a tool that allows for self-employment and social entrepreneurship in communities from most affected regions, and including this on the 60 Million Girls COVID-19 related news webpage. Now I'm going to pass it back to Gina, who's going to start us off on some of the broader recommendations outlined through our theory of change.
Thank you, Nayantara. So ultimately, what we aim to do in this policy lab is building a model in which results speak for themselves. And to this point, we all can agree that what we need today is new ways of thinking about the delivery of quality education in remote areas. And to do so, we need the following. We need context-sensitive learning materials, new stakeholders and supporting groups, multiple new uses and users of the MLL, new emerging roles, alternative financing mechanisms, engaged communities, and a transversal inclusion of the human rights-based approach. Based on these insights, Guru is going to present to us our theory of change. For those who are not related to this term, is a strategic framework that shows how change happens in the short, medium, and long term, and their actions required to do so.
All right, thank you so much, Gina. So rather than giving you all a static list of recommendations, we actually want to walk you through the dynamic way we see our suggestions and recommendations play out to our overall theory of change. So as you can see on the left of our theory of change, we have a number of recommendations that 60 million girls, starting with implementing MLL best practices by socializing them with the implementing partners, adopting a continuous learning process for new best practices, mapping and engaging educational stakeholders, adopting a participatory approach to empower community members and build capacity, assessing co-financing as a funding mechanism, integrating a human rights-based approach into the evaluation matrix, and allowing more information to be made publicly available, in addition to designing a social business model with a gender approach. These recommendations will result in improved educational outcomes, as you can see in the next column, which specifies what those outcomes will be. And these will be further amplified in collaboration with the relevant stakeholders using a child-centered approach. As you can see on the far right, these recommendations would culminate into helping Sierra Leone make substantial progress towards SDGs 4.1, 4.5, and 5B, focused on free, equitable, and quality primary and secondary education provision, elimination of gender disparities and equal access, and the leveraging of technology to empower women across communities in Sierra Leone. Based on our theory of change, we have also recommended a detailed 3-phase solutions roadmap that highlights the specific actions that are required across all phases. This 3-phase solutions roadmap is presented in our executive summary, and we highly encourage you all to give it a read through. I will now pass it on to James to highlight some concluding remarks.
We would like to close our presentation with an invitation to everyone listening who is engaged or interested in crossing educational gaps worldwide. We want to call for greater ambition as all of us look ahead to new ideas and partnerships that can help models like these continue to grow. Millions of girls like Aminata are striving for a better future, and communities worldwide are struggling to cross the digital divide. And we believe that the MLL gives us a way to address both: access to quality education and digital resources. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, team. That was a great presentation. I'd like to know whether Aminata has used the MLL, and if not, what would she say about this presentation? But you don't have to answer that just yet. You can think about that. I'd like to turn it over to three faculty for questions, starting with Natalie Duchenet, and then Jennifer Welsh, and then Lucy Locke. So Natalie, please take it away. Sorry, that was perfect timing. You didn't need to hear the egg buzzer. Natalie.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, team. I would be interested in learning a bit more about the government in Sierra Leone, their priorities, and how education fits inside those priorities.
Thank you so much, Natalie. That's a very interesting question, and I can take that. So our overall solutions roadmap and recommendations are not specifically targeted towards the government, but rather focus on complementing the government's existing efforts towards improving educational outcomes in Sierra Leone. Our overall recommendations contribute to the general overarching vision of the government, which is to have an appropriately educated, entrepreneurial, and innovative citizenry who is internationally competitive by 2030. And to do this, we have recommended aligning the MLL content to the national curriculum, collaborating with the government stakeholders to improve the overall educational infrastructure and equipment, to MLL deployment within the schools, also co-financing, which provides avenues for financing to which the government may partner with any stakeholders or funding partners to ensure the financial sustainability of the project. And also, we encourage the cross-government participation of the government. And what this basically means is one of the key stakeholders, like the Ministry of Basic and Senior Secondary Education, can work in collaboration with the Directorate of Science, Technology and Innovation, the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development, and the Ministry of Local Government and Rural Development to basically align and collaborate on how these interventions and ideas can be taken forward. So that is how we feel the government, how we see the government's role fitting into the overall framework, education framework for the education priorities that we have highlighted in alignment with the SDGs.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn to Jennifer Welsh now for a question or two.
Hi, good morning. It's a little noisy behind me. Saskatchewan is waking up. So I've got just a few quick questions for you. Thank you so much for the presentation. The first is quite a general one, and that is that given the MLLs were already conceived and you had some data, could you say a bit more about what you see as your specific value add with your recommendations? So that's the first question. The second is a question about parents as stakeholders. When we think about the need to build support for the use of this tool, and where in your, you talk a little bit about teacher training, but I'd like to know more about how specifically you plan to encourage parents as stakeholders to support the use. And I say that because the MSMEs that you see as a kind of key funder for this initiative, they're also parents. And so in a sense, they have dual identities when we think about them in the context of Sierra Leone. And my last question links to Natalie's point that you have a notion of a social business model with a gender approach. So the message is, do this because it's good for the labor market. But education is about more than the labor market. It's also about building citizens. And so I just wonder, in your approach, how are you also speaking to that mission of education, that it's to, which I guess is in part about the government, but potentially about other stakeholders as well. So there's
Okay,
a set.
three questions. The first on value added, the second on how to get parents on board, and the third on labor market versus citizenship, or maybe both. Okay, so team, you can figure out who takes which question.
Sure. So I can take the first question on the value add. So first of all, in terms of the value addition, we see that, especially in light of the current ongoing pandemic, we see the increasing role of the digitization of education. And within that, we see that the use of the MLL will be particularly helpful to provide MLL within communities which do not have access to the internet or which are high risk. And the mobile nature of the MLL in itself basically helps in that sense, because it helps the provision of the MLL within those communities based on the different regulations, and it can be adapted based on the different restrictions in the different communities. So that is one of the major value additions that we see in light of the ongoing pandemic. Secondly, we also suggest the engagement of the business community. So we feel that in order to scale up the MLL, there is currently a policy window that you can call in order to engage the business community a bit more by highlighting the current value addition that the MLL brings into the educational landscape, to engage them to basically promote and potentially provide funding for the MLL projects within Sierra Leone. So I feel like those are the two major value additions in terms of the path forward for promotion of the MLL and building a scalable model for it.
Thank you, Gulruk, and thank you, Professor Welsh, for your question. It's a good question. The model we would like to follow for our proposal and our recommendations is that it's from the community and with the community. You're right that caregivers really do have a huge role to play, but I'd like to make a distinction between caregivers and then mothers particularly. Our engagement plan is rooted in the HRBA principles of empowerment and non-discrimination, and at all stages of the engagement process, it keeps in mind the children as the right holders and then makes special efforts to engage their caregivers. The idea is that by providing a safe space to relay concerns, the women specifically, given just the cultural context, will be encouraged and feel empowered to speak up about decisions that affect their children's lives. So specifically when it comes to how do we engage the caregivers and mothers, well, we think about public meetings, which provide the community members with an opportunity to set or influence the implementation plan and close any knowledge and awareness gaps that you were talking about when it comes to the uptake of the MLL. We think that given that it's a relatively new technology within the communities, there has to be a demonstration of how it's used. And once that they're able to see how it is being used, they can see the quality of the education that will happen thanks to the MLL. We also suggest workshops and focus groups, especially in communities where cultural norms may prevent the women and girls from confidently sharing their thoughts. And this, like I said earlier, could look like small women and girls only focus groups where participants can openly discuss some of the cultural barriers. But when it comes, like you talked about the MSMEs, one thing we recommended in our approach was that as it is currently deployed, the tablets are under the guardianship of mothers and caregivers, actually. So traditionally, many girls need to walk long miles to attend schools, which could be unsafe. And as such, the caregivers may be reluctant to send girls on this journey. But if we encourage that it needs to be community-based and that the caregivers and mothers themselves have to start being guardianships of these devices, I think, again, that would help with the knowledge and awareness gaps closing, as well as encouraging girls to follow their mothers to these MLL libraries, and then they can also engage with it.
Okay, I think I'm going to, I've been chatting with Jennifer here, and I think I'm going to take Jennifer's third question. I'm going to put it into our third session. So that gives you more time to think about labor market versus citizenship. And in the meantime, let's go to Lucy Locke from the School of Social Work. Lucy.
Right, thanks. Thanks for a terrific presentation. I mean, you're very compelling, and your passion for this topic is very clear. I really appreciated in your write-up the way in which you articulated your assumptions and anticipated risks. I'm wondering if you could describe one risk that you're the most concerned about and what the mitigation strategy for that risk would be. That's one question. Second question has to do with metrics. I think James, you spoke about, cognitive and non-cognitive outcomes that have been looked at. I have lots of questions about that, but I guess the one that I could pull out of a hat has to do with the cultural context and measurement. I'm wondering if you could speak to that. And I do have a third question, which you may toss into into later, and that has to do with children with disabilities. That's my research background is in children with disabilities, and so I'm really grappling with what that would look like if we have, according to our certainly Canadian data, 1 in every 10 to 11 children has a brain-based developmental disorder of some sort. How would an MLL work, or how would a rollout of these MLLs work in, given the consideration of childhood disability?
Lucy, with your permission, I'm going to put your third question into our third session with Jennifer's third question.
Sure.
Team, why don't you take on the first 2 questions?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that questions. I can identify 2 actually. So 2 of the risk and assumptions, 2 of the risk of this project. So while we're doing this project, we came across to a great deal of questions, and this was mainly because we barely know about Sierra Leone or the working field. And that's why we decided to complement our proposal with this analysis, right? The risk and assumption. And I would say the main risks and assumptions are around interest and resources. Our recommendations rely on the idea that beneficiaries will find this MLL of interest and that they will see the benefits of using it. And especially in the case of the women-owned social business model, what if they don't want to start a business? Or what if they drop out their business training program? And the same happens with the identified stakeholders. Will they be interested in this new model? Will they prefer to donate or engage with other causes? And in terms of resources, 60 million girls will have to evaluate whether it's a good option to establish maybe a project management office to put words into action and implement our solutions roadmap and translate it into a work plan and a budget. But in any case, and going back to your question, there will always be a knowledge gap when you propose something for someone without that person. So for us, is this very well-known say, nothing about us without us, right? But this actually could be a call for our recommendations to be validated with local implementing partners and beneficiaries. But thank you for bringing that up. So the second part of your question, or the second question about data collection, the issue of developing evidence-based policymaking is a huge problem these days because the pandemic has, to some extent, restricted data collection in field. And this requires a revision of the current MLL monitoring and evaluation system, especially the methods and means of verification. Another way to address this problem is by updating to the latest version of Rachel devices that have the capability, as I mentioned before, to report back data to local coordinators. This may be confusing to some of you because it was for us at the beginning. So Rachel is the device. It's like a wireless USB that looks like a router, and you can access to offline information uploaded there. So one thing is the device, and the MLL is the mobile learning lab as an educational model. Okay, so once you have reliable and sufficient data, the next step is to engage stakeholders. That is to gather, as Nayantara mentioned, local implementing partner frequently, integrate beneficiaries into the discussion, ask them not only about the outcomes we're trying to measure, but also about their perceptions. What would they do it differently? And if so, how would they do it? The idea and part of our proposal is to institutionalize the learning experience as a cyclical and inclusive process. And in other words, this would mean to implement a Kaizen philosophy and continuous improvements in 60 million girls practices. I hope that those have answered your question.
Okay, thank you very much, Gina. So let's turn now to questions from representatives from the 60 million girls. So I've got Wanda, and then Vida, and then Roberta. So Wanda.
Hi, Chris. Thank you very much. First of all, before I ask any questions, I would like to thank you, Chris Reagan and Natalie Duchesne, for inviting us to be able to participate in this. It's been a wonderful experience. Gina, James, Sarah, Gulruk, Nayantara, you guys have been really wonderful. You've given me and our whole team a lot to think about, a lot of insight, a really different perspective coming into the Mobile Learning Lab. As you stated, we've been using it for a number of years, and we really want to see how we can grow, make it grow and increase it. One thing that I particularly appreciate is your talk about the process. Really, you know, where do we go from here? We're a completely volunteer-run organization, so we don't have a lot of resources, and sometimes it looks like a huge mountain ahead of us. But I know you've put together a sort of a practical approach with different steps. I guess one of the things I'd like to ask you, and it's a very general question, I don't know which one of you want to answer it, but when you looked at this from the time that you started to where you are today, what surprises you the most about how we can go about and impact education in a country like Sierra Leone?
Okay, who's up to answer about the surprise?
Maybe I can start with, okay.
No, go ahead, Sam.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I just think it kind of touches upon, if I'm understanding your question correctly, it's what surprised us about how it has so much value in educating girls.
Yes, yeah. And
Yes.
Where do we think we can go with it from here?
Okay, so the thing, initially, when you think about education, there's this consistent debate between should education be publicly provided or should the provision of education be privatized, right? And going in there, I think my impression was, well, we know that right to education is there and that the children are the right bearers and the state is the duty holders for that. But I think MLL changes that conversation quite a bit. Not saying that the MLL is going to replace the private companies that sponsor it or fund it are going to replace the government. But I think what surprised us the most is that there is this new area where there is organizations that can use education, which is privatized, to complement / supplement education. Initially, when we're talking about the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, the goal was to try and get children educated. But the conversation has changed now. The conversation is how do we get quality education for children, right? And that, I think, is what really surprised me, because that is what the MLL does. In both senses, it's because of its portability, it can go to rural areas and remote areas where children don't have access to education. But on top of that, we are also focusing on this quality aspect of it. So that's the first part. And then I'm going to let Sarah finish up.
Yeah, I was going to say about the access to education, and it's more about when we are introducing instruments like MLL in rural communities of Sierra Leone. I myself come from a developing countries. I've worked in rural communities. You see amazing outcome from children accessing those technology devices, which they have never seen before. So the level of confidence you see in those children is something that's impactful for the project. And the skills development comes along very easily, because as we all mentioned that it's a self-directed approach, it's pure learning. And we have seen what Sugita Mitra has been experimenting for the past 2 or 3 decades now, and what Khan Academy is doing. So all these miracles of technology, we are very easily saying that miracles of technology, but when we deploy them in rural communities, we see this transformative, the shift in education and the shift in learning that goes beyond the textbook learning and the skills development. That's what I see in rural communities.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's continue with 60 Million Girls. I've got Vida, and then on deck is Roberta.
Hi everyone, I'm talking to you guys from Toronto, Ontario, so it's nice to see such a diverse bunch around this topic that we've been grappling with or developing for many years. So my question, and I want to be brief, I know there's not much time and there seems to be a lot of great conversations yet to be had. So my question was really about this idea of scaling, and you presented a really robust kind of framework to scale, which is exactly what we're looking for. But our worry has always been, when you scale something like this, how do you maintain the oversight? How do you make sure that it doesn't get out of hands? You know, we can diversify and get it into hands of more than just the typical student, the typical elementary school student that we've been working with. But how do you make sure that the integrity of the MLL remains, that it's really to educate?
Okay, team.
Yeah, so I can start off by answering that, and then maybe Gina can follow up. So I think that one of the ways that we believe that the integrity of the MLL can be maintained while also expanding it in terms of different avenues is, like, for example, one of the cases that we mentioned is that it can be adapted in the context of students with disabilities, for example. So over there, we understand that the MLL, it results in improved learning outcomes on both qualitative and quantitative metrics in terms of numeracy and literacy skill scores improvements, but also, like, one of the most essential features is that it gives the students more confidence. And the way that we feel that the integrity of the MLL can be maintained is by keeping at the forefront girls, especially young girls, and their educational outcomes as centric to the model, while ensuring the adaptability of this to different and unique contexts, such as the case of students with disabilities.
Thank you, Guru. So, I'm sorry, I want to compliment on that. So I think your concern is also this implementation through social enterprises. I read in the chat. So maybe I can elaborate a little bit on that, and we can understand, what we need for you to understand is we're trying to change how the operational framework is currently on place. So we are not trying to change the focus or the target, but who ultimately is implementing the MLL. So the logic behind this is, you all know the traditional way to run development projects is through short-term interventions, right? But what happens next? Who's taking the lead? We think that what 60 Million Girls can do is to transition the approach of their projects. So what we propose is that in the long run, this is actually a long-term proposal, local women entrepreneurs would be the contractors in charge of running these labs in places they know and with people who trust them, as I mentioned before. And local implementing partners, instead of executing the MLLs, they would be oriented to train these women in business and management skills so they can run the labs on their own. For us, is a win-win situation, because we're helping children and women at the same time. You can educate children and empower women at the same time. This is basically our proposal, but I'm happy. I hope this answers your question. I'm not sure if you have that.
Thank you. Thank you, Gina. I'm going to turn to Roberta, and we are just in our last 8 minutes. So I think we need quick questions and quick answers if we're going to get everybody in. So Roberta, over to you, please.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for all your wonderful work. My question, I'm from 60 Million Girls, and my question has to do with the aspect of data collection. I saw it was mentioned a few times, and Gina, you spoke of the upgrade to the Rachel. Just wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more on what you might have seen or what you might be thinking about regarding data collection and how it might be used. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Roberta. That's a great question. I think that there are a number of elements to this question. So with previous deployments of the MLL, we have data that's mostly been submitted through country reports and occasional sort of focus groups or control group studies, excuse me, that sort of give a sense of both the qualitative and quantitative benefits of the MLL. But of course, things like that are being proposed by the new Rachel of sort of having an automated data collection thing. I think they bring up some interesting questions about equity and how that's handled and how the data is used. And these things are really, really important. And I think, again, it returns to a cornerstone of our presentation generally, which is stakeholder engagement. In my ideal world, I would have the aspects of data that are being collected be submitted to the communities themselves. What is relevant for you to understand about the MLL? What do you want to know? What do you want to know about it? And then these kind of things could be leveraged on both the design of the delivery as well as the content modules themselves. So for example, let's say someone is learning, math in a particular way that's not relevant to their cultural context. They would have the opportunity to say, hey, this isn't really working for us. Is there a way to redesign this so it's, in Creo, or it contains more examples that are relevant to our local context? So these kind of dynamics will have to be thought about quite carefully, I think.
Okay, thank you. Folks, we're in the last 6 minutes, and we're now going to turn it over to questions from the general audience. I've got 4, which we may not all get to. So I'm going to start with Danielle and then Philip. And then if we have time, Lucy and then Jen for their third questions. So Danielle, please.
Thanks. I will try and keep it quick. My question does kind of connect with Natalie's earlier question about the Sierra Leone government. I'm wondering if you can talk more about the practicalities of how government can be engaged with the deployment and implementation of mobile learning labs.
Sure, so I can take that. Great question. Thank you, Danielle. So as I mentioned earlier, our solutions roadmap and overall recommendations are not specifically targeted towards the government in particular, but are really pitched as supplementing the government's existing efforts towards improving the overall educational outcomes. And for that, like if you see across our overall recommendations, they align with the government's existing vision, which is to have educated, entrepreneurial, and internationally competitive citizens by 2030. And we have recommended doing this by aligning the content to the national curriculum that they have for education, collaborating with the different government stakeholders to improve the educational infrastructure and basically help them to provision of the equipment, of the MLL equipment, and deploying them to the different schools in rural areas, and then also co-financing by providing avenues for financing to the government and to public-private partnerships and so on. And then also like cross-government partnership within like the different ministries, like the Ministry of Basic and Senior Secondary Education, Ministry of Finance and Economic Development, and so on. So basically that's how we feel that the government can be engaged throughout the MLL deployment and implementation process, because they do play a crucial role in attaining the educational outcomes that are required in Sierra Leone.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Philip Harrison. And then if we have snappy answers, we will get to Lucy Locke's third question on children with disabilities. So team, get ready for that. Philip, your question, please.
Well, I'll try and make the question snappy as well. So a very professional presentation, but a lot of polysyllabic words. So if I were to go into a country, to another country, how can I benefit from your experience? What 3 pitfalls, and it doesn't have to be 3, obviously, what 3 pitfalls should I look out for to the effective implementation?
I think there are a few to address. One that I would highlight particularly, and then I might invite the feedback of my team, is just having a robust funding model that's context specific. One of the things we wrestled with is thinking through, again, this private public aspect of things, and it's really context specific as far as the infrastructure of a government or industry to support rollout of a model like this. But I wonder if my colleagues have anything to add.
Another point I would like to add to that is there are some risks associated with overall community engagement, because in different developing country contexts, there could be different social norms in terms of the role of women within society. So for example, one of the recommendations that we're proposing is a social business model that is targeted specifically for women. So there might be a challenge in encouraging women to take on this role in certain developing country contexts. So that's also something that would we would need to be very often implementing this in different contexts.
Okay, we're going to come right in under the wire with a last question. Last question from Lucy Locke. You want to remind us quickly what it is, Lucy, and then the team can give a quick response.
Yeah, I was reflecting on the prevalence of kids with disabilities and in the communities, and how an MLL for kids with disabilities as opposed to for an MLL for kids without disabilities, what would that look like? What would a rollout of that look like?
So I think one of the points that we mentioned earlier is how the MLL results in improved literacy and numeracy skills, but that is just one of the quantitative element. one of the other key features of the MLL in terms of learning outcomes is the increased confidence that it promotes. And 60 Million Girls has actually worked with a partner organization which has done a pilot project specifically targeted towards disabled children. And it was, and within the outcomes of that project, it was highlighted that it did result in improved confidence. And within the classroom framework, it actually encouraged disabled children to feel like they were at par in terms of the learning outcomes that they were attaining in the classroom environment, even with like other students, like at par with other students. So I feel like the inculcation and promotion of confidence within disabled children is one of the key learning outcomes, which makes this particularly adaptable for disabled children.
Sorry, I want to add to that just quickly. That's something that Wanda highlighted pretty well the last few months, is that the MLL is a playful tool and is self-paced. So this is a solution, and we have to recall that we're talking about children, very curious and digital native. So more than thinking in terms of limitations, I think the options and the options here are very wide. So I wanted to add.
2 seconds, if I may. Just that the content modules is also like paramount in this regard. So the MLL is like completely customizable with things you can upload on it, and you can easily sub in different content modules so that everybody's able to learn at their own pace.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to bring this to a close. Natalie told me that we have a hard stop on the hour, and I am just going to stay on Natalie's good side. So I want to thank you all for being here today, faculty, staff, sponsors, students, everybody else. Thank you for attending. And special thank you to 60 Million Girls. Great to have you involved in a policy lab, and I hope we can do it again. Another special thank you to Niadi, who is the coach of this team, and a special thanks to the team itself. I think you did a terrific job. James, Gina, Gulruk, Nayantara, and Sarah, thank you very much for your commitment, your passion, your enthusiasm. So thank you all very much. We're going to take a 1-hour break, and we're going to come back for session 3. So everybody can fill up